Hey, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining, everyone. Welcome to the Castor Career Enhancement Core. We'll call this a workshop because there's an activity. AI as your research writing partner. I'm Ella August, and for those who I don't know, I'm a faculty member in the University of Michigan School of Public Health, Department of Epidemiology, and I'm also part of the Castor Career Enhancement Core. This workshop builds on previous presentations on how to write and edit using ChatGPT. Today, I'm going to be highlighting Claude, but it's not really a Claude how-to. Today's workshop will encourage you to and provide tips on how to collaborate with AI as your writing partner. Thanks to Molly for organizing and hosting and for her feedback on the draft workshop slides. I also want to thank the entire Career Enhancement Core for their support, including David Mendez, Ritesh Mistry, and Nargis Travis, and of course, Molly. So this is an overview of the presentation today. I'm going to start by discussing some common challenges of writing with AI. And then I'll cover two principles for partnering with AI for academic writing. I'll briefly introduce Claude. I'll provide some examples of partnering to show what that might look like. And then you'll have a chance to do a hands-on activity with Claude. And then we'll do a little debrief. I'll ask you to share out about your experience and you can ask questions. But we wanted to start with a poll just to get some sense of your experience, how much you're using AI and what programs you're using. Molly, would you be able to launch the second question first? So the most frequent tools used are ChatGPT, which is not surprising, and Google Gemini. I was just sharing with Molly before we got started that, yeah, Google Gemini is really gaining a foothold and getting much better and much more widespread. So that's very interesting. Claude, we have about 20% of users, of participants using Claude, and then Copilot at 40%. So Claude is the least frequently used. So that's interesting. And nobody checked Perplexity or Elicit or Consensus. Okay, so thanks for completing that. Just one more question for you all.
Ella, there's actually, if you scroll down, there were a couple of other responses on
Oh, I
Grammarly.
see. Okay, thank you. Grammarly, 40%, and then U of M GPT at 60%. Thanks, I missed that. So, yep, so a lot of ChatGPT, Gemini, and Copilot users. Okay, so this one is asking you about your frequency of use. And this is just a very general question, considering all of your work activities. Okay, we have a big distribution here, a big spread. So one person occasionally using them, two people often using them, one person using them every day, and one person using them multiple times a day. So yeah, it seems like we have a nice mix in terms of the types of tools people are using and also the frequency. So thanks for that. We are going to send around a more detailed survey afterward to get a better sense of your use so that we can continue to tailor our programming to your experience levels and needs. So hopefully everyone will come away from this workshop with at least a few new concepts, regardless of your experience level and frequency of use. All right, so the next section is about challenges we face in writing with generative AI. In thinking about the writing tasks that generative AI can help you with, you can think about it helping to clarify your arguments, to restructure your text flow, translate technical content into more user-friendly language, or strengthen transitions between paragraphs. And there are many, many more writing tasks and activity that AI can support you with. But in thinking about any of these or any other writing activities, I'm curious to hear from you. What are some of the challenges you have experienced with Gen AI? If you could type maybe some of your top challenges into the chat and ask Molly to read them out.
Okay, so we have references that are not real papers. Not part of my work process.
Not sure how to interpret that. Does someone
That
want
was me. I guess I'm
Oh,
just saying I'm not used to using it really, so I don't even really think about it being my
okay.
writing process in
To
a way.
integrate into your writing
Yeah,
process, not
that's
integrate.
right. So I feel like
Hmm.
Okay. Others?
Well, it looks like so Jamie had made that first comment about references that are not real papers, and Chenlan agrees that she's had the same issue a lot as well. And then Bailey wrote that not responding with what is asked for.
Mhm, mhm. Great.
Ritesh mentioned hallucination in general too, so not just making up papers, but
Okay.
making up, I guess, other things, right? Jamie said providing more information than I actually needed.
Uh-huh.
I will thumbs that one up.
Okay. Yeah, those sound familiar. Um, Great. Yeah, those sound familiar, and I will be touching on some of those points in the workshop moving forward. I'm going to next focus on two specific challenges related to AI, somewhat related to some of these concerns that other people have expressed. So one major critique of generative AI is that its MO is to make users feel good rather than sort of giving them real value. And this has been referred to as gaslighting or performative positivity in the tech world. And this sort of tendency is so extreme that ChatGPT in particular will often not admit it can't do something instead of, sort of just saying like, I can't do that. It will sometimes say, check back in 15 minutes or check back in a few days. And I don't know if anyone here has ever gotten a message like this, but if you do, it means the program can't give you what you're asking for. It just doesn't want to say no. And so that kind of touches on a disconnect that was mentioned in some of these comments about maybe not being responsive to what you're asking for. So disconnect between you and the AI, and some of the hallucinations giving you what you didn't ask for, or more information than is needed. Another challenge related to using Gen AI for writing and editing is the tendency for it to provide edits that don't really improve the writing. And so this sort of overlaps with the first challenge, but this is data from a study I did with several colleagues where we compared edits from ChatGPT to Grammarly in a human copy editor. And you can see in the left, the figure on the left, that overall ChatGPT made about 3 times as many edits than Grammarly or the human editor. And if you look at the figure on the right, focusing on this blue bar, it's a little bit small, but only about half of the edits GPT made actually improve the writing. About a quarter of the edits were neutral, meaning that they didn't really improve the writing, they didn't make it worse, and 14% were judged to make the writing worse. So all of these things are a bit of a disconnect between the user and what the user wants and what the writer wants and what the technology is giving us. All right, so why do these challenges arise? And again, there are certainly more than just 2 challenges. or even the ones that were mentioned here by others, but I highlighted two that are fairly relevant to this presentation. So I'm going to talk a bit about the actions we take as users of the technology that can lead to some of these problems. So in some cases, we might request different types of academic texts and figures, or other, content, and AI can sort of race forward to produce content without having enough information. And this has been called drive-through text, where our engagement is limited to giving one brief prompt, and it can result in output that is less than optimal. So interactions with AI that involve a single prompt to generate output are known as single-turn prompts. And in a recent report, Anthropic, this is the company that created Claude, found a high correlation between the sophistication of our prompts and the sophistication of the output we get. In other words, how you ask determines the quality of what you get. So now I'm going to move ahead with those brief comments about our approach and present two principles for partnering with AI that address those challenges I just presented. And I'll be drawing in part from two sort of like deep thinkers about AI, Tana Means, who has a great Substack on the topic, and Jeremy Utley, who is an adjunct professor at Stanford, among other things. So according to Tana Means, the gap between surface engagement and deep AI engagement is directly tied to the skill we bring to the process. And it does take a bit of practice to increase our skill level here. Hopefully, my hope is that this training session will provide at least some meaningful practice that can help you improve your skills. So Tana Means suggests that we think of using AI as a genuine partner rather than a magic 8-ball, as she calls it. So this sets up principle one, which is augmentation rather than automation. In automation mode, we're prompting AI to spit out some text. However, in augmentation mode, we're using it to augment our own thinking and writing. So achieve augmentation, you really need to engage collaboratively. And one good way to do this is to move from single-turn prompts, where one prompt is used to generate your output, to multi-turn prompts, in which you're engaging in sort of a back and forth dialogue with generative AI to reach your goal product. And the Anthropic report I mentioned earlier, and the link is at the bottom here, identified that the success rate for multi-turn conversations versus single-turn conversations or single-turn prompts was striking. And the approach is not successful because AI is smarter in multi-turn mode. It's because humans stay engaged and intervene in this back and forth exchange to steer toward a high quality output. And here's an example of a very simple multi-turn prompt. So when I was preparing for this talk, I asked Claude to write an academic abstract that sounds like it was generated by AI. And what it gave me is here on the slide. And I'm not going to read it all now. I think you have the slides, but it's so bad and simplistic that it actually was not even a believable example. You could just look at this one sentence as an example of how bad of a bad example it is. In conclusion, sleep is very important and more people should sleep better, right? So giving Claude this single prompt was not really enough guidance to allow it to create a good, bad example. But getting that type of poor output doesn't mean it needs to be the final version, obviously. So I circled back to Claude telling it that it was not a realistic example because it was just way too bad. And this additional prompt is not super elaborate, you can see, but the idea here is that I'm inserting myself back into the process, and I'll, again, let you read this revised version on your own. But the point here is that Claude did circle back to generate an improved bad example abstract. And then below it, which I've just pasted here in the middle, Claude also provided a reflection or summary of why this example is bad. And this could fit into somebody's complaint that you get more information than needed when you're asking AI for, revised writing or whatnot. But the reflection or summary, I'm going to argue, is helpful because you can kind of see the thought process and where it's drawing from in generating the information, which can be particularly helpful, particularly for revising. I'll say more about that in a moment. So just by doing a bit of back and forth, you can really sort of stay engaged in improving your output without a ton of additional labor. Principle 2 is overcoming gaslighting, and it's actually sort of part of principle 1 because it guides us to interact with AI and be more specific about what we want from it. So Jeremy Utley warns us about AI gaslighting and how easy it can feel to accept all of the praise and also the ease and efficiency of just, keeping it simple. One prompt, one output. So there are ways to head off gaslighting even in our initial prompt. Jeremy Utley shares this kind of hilarious approach that he uses to prevent gaslighting. When he asks AI for feedback, he prompts it to do its best impression of a Cold War era Russian Olympic judge. In other words, he's asking it to be brutal, to be exacting, to do its best, deducting points for every minor issue it can find. He tells AI that he can handle difficult feedback to prevent it from gaslighting him. So this is telling AI sort of like right from the get-go how you want it to respond to you in terms of its feedback. Now I'm going to show some additional approaches for partnering with AI for writing that embody the 2 principles I just presented. The first is context engineering. So if you've ever looked at your AI output and thought, well, this sounds too much like AI wrote it, one question to ask yourself is, have you told it what you sound like, right? So whereas traditional prompt engineering might read something like, write me a cover letter for my journal submission. Of course, you need to give details about content, but the point I'm making here is about tone and format, right? Context engineering, on the other hand, tells AI what you sound like, or maybe what you want to sound like. Write me a cover letter in line with this article on how to write a compelling cover letter in the journal guidelines I've uploaded, along with an example of a previous cover letter I wrote. Okay, I'm going to present another approach you can use called chain of thought reasoning. The idea here is that problem solving and decision making improves when we as humans think out loud. Well, it turns out the same is true with AI. When AI, sort of thinks out loud, or in other words, shows its process of producing the output, it's called chain of thought reasoning, and it helps to improve the quality of the output. So you can prompt it with, before you respond to my query, please walk me through your thought process step by step. And this gives sort of a window into the assumptions, the framing, the logic it's following. It just is a little more transparent about how it's coming up with what it came up with. And so once you can see all this laid out, you can correct where it's, maybe going off track a little bit, and steer the model toward exactly what you're looking for. Let's look at another approach. This is called few-shot prompting. This approach refers to being efficient in your AI prompting by essentially just providing examples. So you can provide a good example by telling it, like, this is what a good example looks like to me. In the case of a cover letter, here you might be uploading an example of a cover letter you previously wrote for a different journal. You can also provide a bad example, if you have one, to let it know what you don't want the cover letter to sound like for the output. You can also combine approaches by asking AI to create a bad example and tell you why it's a bad example. This combines few-shot prompting with chain of thought reasoning. It's got some noise here in the background. I'm just going to shut my window, excuse me. Okay. So this is a combination of two approaches. Another approach is assigning a role. So when you assign a specific role to an AI, be it epidemiologist, health policymaker, journal peer reviewer, you're telling it where to go in its knowledge base to like which domain, expertise, and perspective you want it to draw from. So any of these sort of role-based prompts will probably get you a better result than can you review this document. So here are some example prompts. Respond as an expert in academic writing and scholarly communication. Take on the perspective of a journal editor known for rigorous, constructive feedback. How would a behavioral economist approach this research design problem? Or how would a public health policy analyst frame this argument? So those are some specific examples to give you ideas about how this might work in practice. In reverse prompting, you prompt the model to ask you for the information it needs. For example, you can say, I need to write a research statement for a fellowship application. Before we begin, what information do you need from me to write this statement? So this can prevent things like people had mentioned multiple times hallucinations. So this can prevent things like hallucinations where AI is filling in the blanks. AI is filling in the blanks because it doesn't have all the information or it doesn't have enough information, right? So if you give it all the information it needs, then, at least theoretically, it won't be hallucinating or making things up. And as a writing teacher, it also occurs to me that it also has the potential to help us plan. Like the more we can think about the process before we start writing or during the process of writing, the better. Because we're just in that sort of big picture mindset where we're reflecting on our work. You can also combine approaches in a single or separate prompts for higher quality output, depending on what you're asking it to do. So these are just, examples of some of the different approaches I covered and how you might combine them in working with AI. So again, a benefit of working with AI like this or in this way is that many of the interactive approaches do orient you as a writer to work at this higher level where you're considering and reflecting on the text and the process rather than being sort of immersed in the labor of writing each word. So, again, as someone who's taught writing for a long time, this evokes for me the research around writing self-assessment. So the power of guiding writers to review and reflect on their own writing, for example, with a set of guiding questions, is that it helps them get into this reflective mode where they're looking at their own writing with fresh eyes. And this is similar to what tech journalist, Clive Thompson recently found when he interviewed 75 coders who used AI to generate code. So he found something really interesting. He found that when these coders started to rely on AI to write the code, they were actually working at a higher, they weren't sitting back and saying, go ahead, do my work for me. They were actually working at a higher level, more focused on the process and the product. So he summarized this role change as being less like a construction worker and more like an architect. Okay, so those are some approaches and some of the benefits of these approaches. I want to briefly introduce Claude. Sounds like we have some users of Claude, but more people are using ChatGPT and Gemini. So let me just briefly show. This is for U of M users. I realize there's others outside U of M here, but this is how you can access Claude through U of M. You can go to this website and then click, there's two options here, Sonnet and Opus. Because the Claude program evokes these, the different names, Sonnet and Opus, evoke the arts. I'm going to compare each to works of Shakespeare to give a sense of when to use one versus the other. And maybe the real reason I want to go down this road is I see a very rare opportunity to use my literature undergraduate degree. So I appreciate you indulging me just for a moment. Whereas Opus is better for big, hefty, complex analyses or other tasks. The comparison here is to the very weighty Richard III. It's slower and uses more resources. Sonnet is better for lighter tasks, including writing sonnets and all other types of writing, analysis, as well as coding. It's faster and less resource intensive. So we're going to use Sonnet in this presentation, and you should use that in your own writing tasks as well. Next, I have a quick example to show you how you might, or just to show an example of collaborating with Claude. Okay, so this is an initial prompt. This is a human's initial prompt, and the draft text they entered into Claude. And the prompt here is pretty simple. Here she's asking Claude for a specific type of writing, academic writing. She specifies what improvements she's looking for. She wants improved clarity and concision. And she also asks Claude to summarize the key changes it makes in the revised text it generates, and then pastes her first draft here. And here's Claude's initial output. I'm not going to read through all of this now, but you have the slides and you can look at it on your own, and then Claude's explanation of changes. In this next step, the writer pushes back because the output wasn't quite what she wanted. So here the writer's saying it's better, but there needs to be more hedging because this is scientific writing. And then Claude builds on the original prompt or the initial prompt, the initial output, and the second prompt to revise what it wrote. So this pushback moment transforms her interaction with Claude from a single turn prompt into a multi-turn prompt. But more importantly, for our purposes, it represents the partnership moment where the collaboration happens, where you're both building the output over multiple prompts. So the example I just showed demonstrates several principles of AI as partner. The writer retains the authority. Claude responds to the writer's expertise, not the other way around. Iteration improves outcomes. The best results emerge from dialogue, not a single prompt. The example I showed didn't actually specifically do this, but asking AI for a diagnosis of problems with the writing prior to revising can be helpful because it sort of forces an explicit identification of the weaknesses or what it sees as the weaknesses, which can both give you clues about whether you want to accept those revisions, and it also can help teach you about writing if they're accurate, and maybe you're kind of going down the same road again and again with some weaknesses in your writing skills, it is a learning moment. Explanation from Claude is meant to build trust. Asking Claude to explain his changes allows the writer to evaluate and accept or reject them critically. It just gives you a little more information. And then finally, the disciplinary and contextual knowledge you're using drives better prompts. Bringing your own, sort of perspective and expertise to the conversation is going to help Claude to build a more appropriate, paragraph or whatever output that it could have done without your context knowledge.